Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Nassau County Legislator Josh Lafazan. Legislator, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
Of course, anytime. I do want to talk about this over this weekend, what we saw, and Hamas launched an attack on Israel that the nation hasn't seen in decades. And you posted, I want to get personal for a second. You did post that you had family in Israel. First, how are you?
I appreciate the question. It's been a really scary week for my family, probably the scariest week that we've experienced in our lives. My dad's brother, my uncle, made Aliyah about 15, 20 years ago. They live in Israel. My cousins volunteered to serve, and did their service, and they just actually got called up to reserve duty. And so we're thinking of my cousins, praying for their safety. And I ask all your viewers to think of my cousins. My grandma is over there visiting, and she's with my family sheltering in place. And so it's personal for me. And so to pause and ask your viewers to pray for all those in uniform, and to pray for all those civilians to stay safe in the conflict zone.
And I do now want to ask, and we're thinking of your family, obviously, we're thinking of you, them over there. But I do want to ask first what you think of the United States' response. I'm going to read you a statement from President Biden. He said that he told Netanyahu that the U.S. will, quote, stand ready to offer all appropriate means of support. What's your reaction so far to that response?
Sure. So I'll tell you, the United States has an ironclad special relationship with Israel, and it's for specifically times like these, times of crisis, where for Israel to know that it has the backing of the United States, I think sends a strong message to its adversaries as well as to its supporters. The United States on the world stage has been able to rally the developed nations all across the world who have put forward messages of support. You looked at the joint statement from the United States and France, the UK, and I believe it was Canada. And so I'm proud that the United States is unwavering in our unequivocal support for Israel. That support will need to continue as the conflict deepens and as Israel does what it needs to do to completely eradicate Hamas for the next 50, 100 years.
As of right now, the United States is standing firm in its allyship with Israel. But what would you like to see going forward from the U.S.? Biden said he would support Israel in any way. What would you want that to look like?
Sure. So first and foremost, we have to look at what the Israeli Defense Force needs, right? We have to look at what type of military aid they need. We already provide a substantial aid package, but they'll need replenishments for the Iron Dome, as the Iron Dome has been completely overwhelmed with indiscriminate firing of rockets from Gaza fired at civilians. So replenishing those Iron Dome batteries, working to provide logistics assistance, whether it's by air, by land, by sea, making sure that we move swiftly, because remember, the House doesn't have a speaker. Right. And so making sure we are moving as expeditiously as possible to get our government back to business, to provide an aid package to Israel will be crucial. Of course, we want to make sure we're cooperating with our Israeli partners to bring back all of those who are held hostage. We know there are not just Americans, but people of all different nationalities held hostage. I think confronting Iran is really important here. Ensuring that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon is of enormous import, and deterring Iran from getting involved in this conflict. Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. It's been reported that Iran was in coordination with Hamas on the attack. And so making sure we're confronting Iran and all those state sponsors of terrorism. And of course, we have to combat anti-Semitism here in the United States. This is such an important issue to see, extreme far left fringe groups hosting a celebration of the acts of barbarism from Hamas, to see students from my alma mater, Harvard, putting blame squarely on the Israeli government. It's been so disappointing to see such vile anti-Semitism, and to see anti-Semitism veiled as anti-Zionism, and we need to combat it here on the homeland.
I want you to talk about that Harvard statement. Over 30 student groups at Harvard released a statement denouncing Israel, putting the blame on them. As you said, you're a Harvard grad. What is your response to that? And what action would you like to see Harvard take?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you do some research, and I think David Frum had tweeted about it, that Harvard was on the wrong side during the first Holocaust too. right? Publishing a piece about Harvard University and the Hitler regime. So Harvard was on the wrong side of history then. If they don't speak up, they're on the wrong side of history now. To see such a tepid response from Harvard's leadership after so many student organizations so callously and brazenly celebrated the barbaric acts of terrorism from Hamas, it was absolutely devastating for me as an alum. And I know so many alums like me believe this. And so I've written a letter to Harvard's president asking for a far stronger statement of condemnation. I am shocked and quite frankly confused as to why, when other tragedies happen, Harvard is very quick to issue an unequivocal statement, but yet equivocates in one of the worst acts of terrorism that I've seen in my lifetime. And so it's time that Harvard and other universities, right? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, so many organizations where radical students are promoting this radical, really extremist view, that the schools have the courage to speak up and say, this is not the view of the broader institution. Time is of the essence, and they better speak soon.
Where do you think this extremist view is coming from?
Sure. So I will tell you, put frankly, as somebody who is 29 years old, right? Somebody who's a millennial, but somebody on the cusp of that Gen Z generation, there is a real frightening wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism bubbling up in this next generation, who has been misinformed through social media posts, who's been radicalized on the internet, and unfortunately is spewing absolute ignorance in broad daylight here. And so we see these young students groups on some of the best college campuses in the country. And we have to combat it head on, because if this next generation harbors this type of gross sentiment, these are people who are going to run for office and who are going to run organizations and companies in the decades to come. And we need to boost those voices who are speaking up for humanity and truth. This is not the time to equivocate it. You cannot unequivocally condemn the torture, the rape, the murder, the kidnapping of human beings. If that is not enough for you to unequivocally condemn, then at what point have you lost your humanity? And so this is not a time to equivocate. This is a time to be firm and be very direct, that you either stand on the side of humanity and human rights, or you stand on the side of terrorism and barbarism.
The videos, the photos, the headlines, the stories, the reporting of what we saw from this weekend on, there's no words to describe how horrific it was. There are dead bodies, babies in cages, people killed, people seeing their families die. It's just horrific. Just this morning, there were headlines that Hamas beheaded babies. I mean, there's no words to describe this at all. And I want to say first, many lawmakers have unequivocally stood with Israel, condemning Hamas, but there are some on the left that have shifted away from their support in Israel, and I want to get your take on that. I want to read you a statement from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. She said this, quote, "The path to that future must include lifting the blockade, ending the occupation, and dismantling the apartheid system that creates the suffocating, dehumanizing conditions that can lead to resistance." End quote. As long as our country provides billions in unconditional funding to support the apartheid government, this heartbreaking cycle of violence will continue. And some of her colleagues did immediately come out and condemn that statement. But what do you make of that?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, Rashida Tlaib is an anti-Semite and not a serious person, let alone somebody who's deserving of being in the United States Congress, along with Ilhan Omar and a few other anti-Semites in the Congress. They're no longer afraid to hide behind anti-Semitism. It's now out in broad daylight. And so it's really important that Democrats and somebody like me, who's a Democrat who believes unequivocally in the right not only of Israel to defend itself, but in human rights and in the laws of humanity, and somebody who saw the footage and broke down, because this is a medieval rampage, is what this was, by absolute terrorists. And they're not freedom fighters, as some of my Democratic colleagues call them. They are terrorists. And so when Democrats speak up to unequivocally condemn anti-Semitic people and comments like we hear is when we will see real progress, right? It's when people will speak out against their own parties. It's when friends will speak out against their own friends. And quite frankly, it's why I call on Harvard alums like myself to speak out against these students. The time for being quiet is over. And I will tell you, if you look at some of these videos, to see women tortured and raped, to see babies beheaded, to see families murdered execution style, at what point does this subhuman behavior, at what point do we say that this is absolutely outrageous? And to see institutions equivocate, to see companies afraid to speak or wanting to toe the line, we have to take receipts right now of those who are afraid to speak. And Brittany, let me put it into proportion. 9/11 was an absolute tragedy, one of the worst terrorist attacks in the history of this nation. 3,000 American killed, 20 years ago. Proportionally in Israel, it's about 31,000 killed and 77,000 injured if you look at population differences. This is their 9/11. And in terms of those who call for de-escalation or those who focus their attention on the Israeli government, nobody was calling for de-escalation after 9/11. Nobody was chastising the American government to stand down. And they better not, and they will not tell Israel what to do here. Israel has to do what it needs to do to eradicate Hamas from this earth, to eradicate the problem of Hamas-sponsored terrorism for the next 50 to 100 years, as Israeli security officials have said. This is a problem that won't go away until it's neutralized.
You straight up called Representative Rashida Tlaib an anti-Semite.
Yep.
Do you think top Democratic lawmakers, I'm talking about President Biden, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, do you think that they should be calling this out directly, A? And B, do you think there should be any punishment here? Should they be kicked off committees? What does that look like to you? Because you're running for Congress. Yep. These could be your colleagues soon.
Yeah, Ilhan Omar got kicked off the Foreign Affairs Committee, for similar conduct, and this is why. Right, this is the United States standing for humanity, standing behind our most important ally, standing behind those who are fighting terrorism on the front lines. And to see comments from Rashida Tlaib, I think when politicians are afraid to speak, when they mince words, and when they're afraid to be direct, is when danger happens. She is an anti-Semite. Ilhan Omar is an anti-Semite. And as a Democrat, I'm calling out that colleague on my side of the aisle to say that those fringe views do not represent the broader Democratic Party. And only when Democrats speak up against those the far left extreme elements in our party, will we be moving forward, in terms of progress here. So I'm not afraid to mince words here. When Ilhan Omar says that Jews are all about the Benjamins, that's anti-Semitic and dangerous behavior. When Rashida Tlaib calls Israel an apartheid state, that's anti-Semitic and dangerous behavior, and words matter here. And it's time the United States speaks with one voice, that we unequivocally stand behind Israel.
Legislator, let's say you do get elected to Congress. Let's say they get reelected. You'll be coworkers with these people. You will be colleagues with these people. How do you work with someone that you're saying, hey, you are an anti-Semite?
Yeah, quite frankly, there are some individuals in Congress who I don't believe should be there, right? And Congress is 435 members. There are plenty of members outside of those fringe extreme on the right and on the left that I can work with to pass legislation. In the Nassau County Legislature, I found a way to work with colleagues on the left and the right to move initiatives forward. And there are some colleagues I disagree with who were unable to do so. That's the nature of politics, is that sometimes disagreements don't allow you to move forward. I don't think that ordinarily disagreements of opinion should prohibit people from moving something forward with a common goal. But if the common goal here is to isolate one of our best allies, if not most important ally in the world, right? If the goal here is the eradication of Israel, as some believe, then I have no business working with them.
What do you think is missing, do you think, from the national conversation? I've had many conversations over the past 2 days about this horrific scene that has unfolded. When you go on social media, when you watch the news, what's missing?
Sure, I think what's missing, first and foremost, is the human appeal of just how awful what is going on is. And so I speak to my friends and I say, as hard as it is, don't look away. as hard as it is to skip those videos, don't look away, because we have to understand the full picture of what we're confronting here, which is, again, a medieval rampage. And when you see images of babies beheaded, when you see women brutalized, raped, and tortured and paraded through the streets, when you see that, and when you understand the full scale of the lack of humanity here, is only when you can understand what needs to be done. Because what needs to be done is Israel needs to eradicate Hamas from the face of the earth. And yes, we support Israel now, but we need to support Israel when they do what they need to do to completely crush this sponsor of terrorism and completely eradicate Hamas from the earth. And so the human element is often missing. And I tell people, as hard as it is, don't look away. Fully understand the consequences here. The second piece that's missing here, and I think this is really important, is the link between anti-Semitism at home and full-on danger for Israel. You see soldiers in France guarding synagogues. You see anti-Semitic behavior in Europe up dozens of percentage points. You see people in the United States go to a rally in Times Square and hold up a swastika on their phone. Anti-Semitism is the pathway towards what they're looking to do, which is completely isolate and in many cases wipe Israel off the map. And so confronting anti-Semitism is not just about eradicating hate. It's about supporting Israel and making sure that Jews have the permanent home that they deserve, making sure that when my grandfather, who was a Holocaust refugee, told me never again, right now is never again. And that's why it's so important.
This is obviously a loaded question, but how do you confront anti-Semitism in the United States? It is on the rise. How do you confront it?
Sure. So I think we turn, as I talk to all the time, we turn to local governments, right? Local government is where things get done, right? The United States Congress is the least productive governing body I think I've ever seen. But local governments and state governments are getting things done. And so on the local level, here's what we're doing. We're making sure we're to uphold and bolster the law that bars companies who support BDS from getting government contracts in Nassau County. What we did here is we adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism to make sure that we have the tools to go after those who perpetrate anti-Semitism in our county. We're working with the police department to shore up security for our synagogues and our places of worship so people can pray and have peace of mind that they'll be safe. And most importantly, if you see something, say something. Hate speech and violent speech directed towards Israel, people need to be held accountable. And so local governments need to lead here. I'm proud to be a leader. I'm proud to be a member of our anti-Semitism task force here in the county. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of some of those bills that I mentioned. And I'll continue to be proudly on the right side of history here and proudly working to eradicate anti-Semitism from our county.
The Jewish people worldwide are hurting beyond measure since this weekend. What is your message to them, and particularly Jewish Americans?
Sure. So I channel the resiliency of my grandfather, who was the greatest man I ever knew. Again, was a Holocaust refugee, fled with his family, came to this country and built a life. And the resiliency of the Jewish people and of Israel was always something that he had spoken to me, that we are a people continually persecuted throughout history, but continually we'll find a way to persevere and grow and make our impact on this world. And so I believe God willing will continue to be blessed by that type of mantra where we stick together when times get tough, where we are in unity in a time of crisis like we are now, and that we will absolutely find our way forward. We will eradicate Hamas from this earth. We will rebuild. We will be stronger and more secure than ever. I have a steadfast belief from my grandfather, and I hope to pass that belief on to people of Jewish faith who are scared or who are concerned right now.
Legislator Lafazan, I appreciate you coming on. It was a tough conversation, but thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for all your work covering this issue.